This is CFO Talks, and I'm Kieran Ryan. Today we're very excited to welcome JoAnns Pohl, the Chief Financial Officer for one of the biggest law firms in the country, Bowmans, which has a long history in South Africa. Jo has had an amazing career. Before joining Bowmans in 2017, she was involved in many types of businesses, from startups to listed companies. She previously consulted to Texton Property Fund on strategy, and prior to this was Executive Director and Group Chief Financial Officer for Teleshore Investment Holdings. This put her in charge of group finance, treasury and risk teams, and she played a pivotal role in implementing the group restructure, which was both local and international. Her role at Teleshore also involved embedding the risk and governance culture and function and establishing the group treasury. Over her career, Jo has held leadership positions at Standard Chartered Bank and as the Chief Financial Officer for Africa and Executive Member on Regional Africa. And that involved 15 countries, 4 listed companies.
Yes, in their various jurisdictions, so listed in their relevant countries.
Okay, and you're a qualified chartered accountant and a member of ACCA and professional banker of the Institute of Bankers in South Africa with a postgraduate diploma in business administration from the University of Wales, and more recently completed a GDPR practitioner program. You must have spent your whole life studying. What's been going on?
I think a big chunk of my life probably studying, but I'm genuinely curious and I get a lot of energy from that. So the technical pieces and being able to spend some time understanding what's relevant in the market at any point in time, I think gets me going. To be quite frank, if I'm tired, a little bit of time in a good book or with a bit of a technical challenge gets me going.
All right, I'm quite interested to learn why, as a trained accountant and chartered accountant, you chose to go from banking and stock exchange listed companies to a law firm, Bowmans being where you are now. What was the attraction behind that?
So I think 2 things, purpose and impact. So the one thing about the move from articles into financial services and banking was because it really helps countries grow. So from a GDP perspective, banking should grow 2.5 times that, and ideally keep households going. And I say that around them almost being noble professions, so both banking and insurance. And so the purpose and impact was very much there for me, and particularly because I worked across the African continent. So the move to a law firm was quite deliberate. One that operated across the region, and Bowmans was SA Law Firm of the Year last year, as well as African Law Firm of the Year, and we have offices in 4 different countries. So that for me was one of the initial appeals. Secondly, I do believe that the ability for professional services, so lawyers, bankers, to work together with policymakers really makes a difference across the region around how you enable transaction flow, whether it's intra-Africa, etc., and growth. So for me, the purpose component was very relevant. What we do from an ethics and integrity perspective at Bowmans actually does impact the well-being of society. So those 2 things have driven me to the shift, because it is quite a big change. I do sit on the MMI lending board, and that's why I stayed on the Standard Chartered board for a while, because I enjoy the technical challenge that banking offers given the regulatory complexity, but the ability for law to enable that is what is attractive to me.
Did you say you still sit on the MMI lending board?
Yes, I'm part of that board at the moment.
That's the MMI group?
No, that's a joint venture that we're busy working on with African Bank as well as MMI Holdings, and we're busy looking at that product set. Over time, that'll obviously change. And you'll notice there was an announcement to market that particular space is going to be unwound. But it's been really an interesting journey to do that with them. All
right. So you're on the lending. What don't they normally call this, like a credit committee if it's a bank?
No, not quite, because it's an external board membership.
I see.
Yes.
Okay. So they're not asking you to sign off on loans. Hey, we want to lend this amount of money.
No,
That's
not at
what you're
all.
doing.
It's a strategic component.
Okay. Banking, of course, is a highly regulated and compliance-driven activity. It's probably one of the biggest headaches that you have in that sector. Perhaps you can give us a sense of how, from your perspective, the role of the Chief Financial Officer has changed over the years in that sector.
So I think from a banking perspective, the ability to be creatively compliant has become more and more important, because compliance is not negotiable. Everyone has to do it, and as a consequence, the reality is each bank faces the same sort of constraints. And what's changed from a CFO perspective is the amount of time and money you have to invest just ticking the boxes from a regulation perspective. Also the relationship piece. So your stakeholder map is bigger and more important. So whether it's with regulators, whether it's with the revenue authorities, policymakers, how you report, actively going to work with them, and also to engage with them on your strategy has become more and more important. So I think the opportunity to influence what some of that regulation might look like and to ensure that your stakeholders are up to date around where you're likely to go has been quite key. So the depth of the CFO relationship around being able to frame, I suppose, and shape the credibility of the institution you work with, market sentiment when you're looking at consensus on results and structure, as well as plan B in terms of discussing with the regulators what you're doing now, what you might do later, and how it influences what you do is quite key. How our team operates is also different. The regulatory piece is your license to trade. It's not the niggly bits that you've put in and the routine stuff. It really is important that you bed that down properly. And the pace of change means that sometimes you need to get ahead of the curve. So being truly interested in why the regulation is relevant, I think is key for a CFO.
All right, we're also joined in the studio by Nicholas van Wyk, who's the Chief Executive Officer for the South African Institute of Business Accountants. And I see you jumping up and down in your chair. Did you want to say something, Nicholas?
Yeah, I found your comments quite interesting on a number of areas. First, you worked in banking and then you moved to law. But the law firm, they chose you because you come from banking. Because in their dealings with their banking clients, you can add a value contribution. It's not just being the CFO and doing the books. And that's also what you described just now, your intricate involvement in many, many things at Bowman. And with the regulators and managing the relationships. So there's a clear distinction for me from your training, your classical training as a CA, to that what you're doing now. And there's a big gap between the two. How did you fill that?
So I think what's quite interesting is your qualification is critical. Your technical credibility is important in terms of demonstrated and proven track record. And the one thing that actually is constant other than change is that generally you're dealing with people. So we are human first. And I think to fill that gap has been around, for me, putting my hand up. So I was absolutely curious in the process. I didn't rely on hope. I think curiosity fuels hope, but hope needs a strategy. So I was quite deliberate on the projects I got involved in and the businesses that I worked with. So that was Barclays, Standard Chartered, Ubank coming back into the South African context and building a relationship with the regulator here, and then in insurance. And that experience, which doesn't necessarily come with age, but rather time in the trenches, has helped close some of that gap. And to be frank, some really hard lessons learned. I remember arriving in Kenya on a Monday morning, and 18 years ago, that's not an easy or mean feat to get into the country with my South African agenda to have a conversation. And everyone asked me about my family, what I do. And I thought I actually don't have time to do these pieces. But it did teach me about people will work with you as opposed to necessarily around you. And the reality is that we are very tactile across the continent. So actually FaceTime, time with individuals, and genuine curiosity has helped close that gap, because it shouldn't be that you're a finance professional at a fast-moving consumer goods company, a listed entity, or at a bank and believe that a balance sheet's a balance sheet or an income statement. You need to understand the business of the business, the people in the business, the relationship pieces, and how the business operates. So the culture is important, and does it work with you? And I also learned a long time that work-life balance is a fallacy. So I rather chose work-life choice to love what I did where I was, which meant that the hours actually didn't encroach on my levels of energy, so to speak, when I got home.
So what I hear you saying, there's a whole bunch of competencies that you added into your career by putting your hand up and being willing to do various and diverse projects other than your classical accounting training. Was there also specific courses, management courses that assisted you in this development route?
So I think one thing that did happen is I took a slight detour at one point. So when I went from KPMG, where I did articles, into the Barclays fold, I joined the talent and training team, partly to demystify treasury training and do consultative selling skills across the region, which required engagement with regulators, because regulation didn't always tie into the banking products we were trying to sell, training investment bankers who did ask me nicely to bring my HR tissues, which I think taught me resilience and grit, because I'm, equally smart. And in that particular space, then having to take up the courses on consultative selling. So truly listening to what the client wants, questioning what you do, being interested. So the why factor came out through that, which would probably not be a normal trajectory in terms of what you would study and pick up from a course perspective. So actually facilitation skills came into that, coaching skills came into that piece, and the relationship building piece around understanding what your client wants. And in our case, particularly as finance professionals, our clients are internal and external, and being able to adapt your style depending on who it was you were working with and what your outcome was. And also the pyramid principle. So I learned how to communicate with different people. Some people like a summary, some people need more detail, and some people need all the detail. And being able to really better understand when to apply what approach. So, supplemented the technical pieces with some soft skills training that possibly when I first started out, I thought I had. But you realize as you grow up so to speak, in business, that there are some skills and tools you genuinely actually need to navigate that landscape.
What you're now describing from a practical perspective, we also recently found in a research that was done by a university in Canada, and the title of the research was Moving from CA to CFO. And they identified exactly these competencies. They grouped them into 34. And they said, but this is the competencies that the CFO needs. And in response, we as an organization then decided, but let's register a designation for CFOs, CFO SA, addressing those competencies. And it's something that CFO Talks is about. How do we get that information out? A hypothesis that I just want to test with you is, we've seen these corporate scandals in Steinhoff, Tongaat, African Bank, Bosasa. And the Bosasa CFO made an interesting comment saying, no, but he was groomed into corruption. In other words, there was an influence from either the board or the CE on him. And the hypothesis is, but maybe his technical knowledge didn't attune him to the fact that he's going to be manipulated. And he was actually open for manipulation. Whereas what you're describing, your experience in the trenches, you won't fall for that because you'll have this internal knowledge. What's your comments on that?
So maybe two things, and a very good example is Enron. So Andy Faster, who's the CFO at the time, got CFO of the Year award in the same year as he got his prison card for the same thing, for off-balance sheet financing. And I think what's quite interesting is businesses almost didn't have a morality factor. So no one stopped to ask, was it right? It's, were you doing it before the next person had done it? Or, so what did the accounting standards, legislation allow in terms of loopholes? And I think the reality now is people asking ethically and from an integrity perspective, is it the right thing to do, is important. And I think being able to ask that, which talks to some of the experience I've had in my career, is also the fact that wherever I am by choice. So if I'm working for you by choice, my opportunity to leave is quite different, and my opportunity to stand my ground when things are not right is a lot more obvious to me. Because if I'm with you by choice, I'm working there by choice, then you make the right decisions. I'm not beholden to you. My livelihood is not dependent on you. And I've been really, really deliberate about those choice factors. So even with my own team now, we spend once a month, we do a coffee club with various really key people in the sector and beyond the sector, partly so that they can think out of the box differently. Secondly, for them to build a network. And also if they work in where they're working, and for me by choice, discretionary effort is obvious. People give just that much more. So I think choice is a very important factor. And we don't realize that we have that opportunity to actually say, this is the no and why, and why, because you have to live with it. And often we say, well, will the auditors accept it? Does it seem reasonable? And my view of that is slightly different. So it's a bit that good conduct is important, and good conduct has no materiality level. So if you are cheating, no matter how big or small it is. And my perspective then is not the four-eyed principle, so what did the audit firm say, but rather if I had to respond to any one of my children, did I do the right thing? And actually that counts, because the level of disappointment you see in the current scenario and the environment around corruption from the people that care about you the most and can't understand it, I think is something that is very hard to live with.
That's a very good ethical test, and I often, confronted with an ethical conundrum, will pose the same question to myself. Would I be happy for my children to know about this? And that really is a check, It really is a check. Tell us about Bowmans, because this may be going out to people overseas who don't know Bowmans. Just give us a very brief thumbnail description of the firm.
So we've been on the continent for 105 years. So deep relationships from that perspective. We have 4 different offices, as I mentioned. We operate across a number of sectors as well as various specialist areas. So we have 3 key departments, being our banking and finance, our corporate department, which covers mergers and acquisitions, tax, and that kind of areas of speciality, competition law. And then we've also got a disputes resolution practice. We operate with multinational clients in the government sector, as well as key individuals, and generally focus on top-end work. So we do board room level from a focus perspective. We have our latest partner actually is Kira, so it's an AI bot that we use as part of our due diligence. So we've got...
Sorry, I missed that. Say that again.
So we've got one of our newest partners last year was Kira, which is an artificial intelligence that actually works as part of our due diligence document review pieces. We've got document automation. So we ourselves are on part of a digital journey as well across the region to make sure that we are more efficient and effective for our clients as a law firm, so that the focus really is on the specialist areas that require judgment, impact, review, thought leadership. And so from that side, I think it's been a great transition around understanding what the legal practice can do across each of the offices. We work very closely with a number of international law firms. We have best friend relationships across the region. And we're very deliberate about not just the type of work we take on, but also the type of client we work with. And our value proposition is really key. So the value of knowing is what our underpinning principle is, but the reality there is knowing the law, knowing the client, knowing the lay of the land, and enablement. So we genuinely help our clients achieve their objectives. And I think for me, that's been one of the key pieces that every day I actually see that. And someone had asked me, how's the honeymoon phase, so to speak, going from financial services into professional services, and now almost 2 years into the space, I can genuinely say that it's the right place to be at the right time for me.
Right. And you have offices in Africa. Where are they?
So Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, we have offices. Our Kenyan operations just over 10 years old. Uganda just under 5. Tanzania is 3 years old. So very deliberate relationships. And East Africa, given what we see at the moment, both from infrastructure, oil and gas, etc., is really a key play. But we've grown up in those markets and quite proudly Bowmans.
And South Africa, you've got offices where?
So in South Africa, we have an office in Cape Town. We have offices as well as a satellite in Stellenbosch, offices in Durban.
Stellenbosch is quite handy for what's going on there right
now. At the moment, yes. Opened that very recently, and then also Sandton, and then an office we've got in Pretoria.
Okay, very good. Are these difficult times for law firms? I'm hearing that the revenue is under pressure. But on the other hand, I hear arguments both ways, that you have far greater levels of regulation and compliance for which you need highly specialized legal skills. And on the other hand, you hear that law firms aren't doing as well as they did some years ago, largely due to the sluggish economy. What's the truth there?
So a couple of things. One, we're an investment firm, so we take a long-term view, which makes quite a big difference around how we do right now this year and how we actually spend our money in the process. And because of that, we invest in our tech, in our people, in our legal infrastructure that helps keep us ahead of the curve, so to speak. Secondly, we have a basket of goods. So because we operate across 4 different jurisdictions and any one of them is in a different space, either from a socioeconomic perspective, politically, or what's happening in that market, and we do have the ability to weather a storm when it's tougher in one versus the other. But across the pieces, and I think the world at large, it's a tough environment at the moment. So more and more our clients, as they become more sophisticated, the pricing is not just the number of hours times your rate and bum and seat kind of structure, but value-based pricing. What is valuable to me? What has an impact? So how we price, how we engage, how we socialize, and that kind of piece, and understand what our clients' needs are, is becoming more and more important. So the level of engagement, I think, is quite crucial, and very deliberate in the conflicts environment that you currently see in the advisory firms and even in our space, is the type of work that we get paid for, and the type of work that we do needs to resonate with who we are from a longevity perspective. But it's not an easy market out there. Work doesn't just walk in through the door. So being a thought leader and recognized as that is important. Making sure in tough times our brand is known, is recognized, is out there, is important. Recruiting the right people and constantly assessing our resources is key.
Okay. As a CFO, take us through a typical day in your life. While you're doing that, explain how an accountant fits into the culture of a law firm, because they're 2 very different personality types.
Okay, I'll start with part 2. I want someone to give me a clear definition of a typical accountant and typical lawyer.
Oh, okay, let me help you out there. Okay, so it's first of all, the way you dress as an accountant is different from the way that you dress as a lawyer.
Okay, that's all relevant if you're all relative, and I say that because if you're a banking accountant, you dress the same as a lawyer. Okay, so definitely suits and ties. And I remember when they introduced casual Friday in banking, we were like, we can't think properly.
Casual Friday in banking?
Yeah,
I remember the Hawaiian shirt day.
No, very hard. Yeah. And I don't like to see my colleagues' kneecaps. It's all relative. So, but they're not so different. So the reality is that lawyers are very relational. They're relationship-driven, and what's been fantastic about lawyers in a law firm is they actually play the ball, not the man. By nature of the beast, they're quite specific about facts, what the letter of the law says and how the process goes. And for me, that's actually a great place to work, because it's not about tackling an individual. They are the first to say well done and thank you, but also to call you out if the behavior is inappropriate or not right or doesn't speak to what you've committed to doing. So that's where I think there's a really big plus around lawyers and accountants working together, because we should be professionally skeptical. We should be holding up the mirror. We should be saying, actually, this behavior doesn't work or this particular process is outside of governance. And so for me, there's a really good gelling space. Also, I spent probably 5 years of my career in retail banking. The balance was in investment banking. So I'm quite used to really smart, really busy, really active A-type personalities and working with them in the process. And I think I enjoy the intellectual stimulation that both of those, that banking and financial services offers, as well as from the legal profession. We really are quite blessed to be able to have good conversations, robust conversations, and be in a space where everyone is recognized for their area of speciality around the table.
Right. So what about your typical day?
So for my typical day, I'd love to say it's 9 to 5, but no longer does that exist from a real perspective. From my side, ideally, to be energized, it takes 90 minutes of deep work. So early in the morning, I generally try and sit down, or late at night, and carve out time to write the proposal we're supposed to be doing, finalize a report piece, do a technical discussion around SMEs and leasing, or work on, for example, an RFP together with what we see in the business development team. So that 90 minutes I carve out in my own time because it's a lot easier versus the distractions that come in and out of your office. We've tried to regularize day-to-day pieces, whether that's approving payments, working with our bankers in terms of our banking structures, etc. So probably first thing in the morning, it's about sitting with my team, checking in. How are you? Good morning. There's a couple of happy birthdays in that space. Well done. You've written an exam. You were sick. And that check-in, and it might probably take me 30 minutes to walk the floor, just sets the tone for the rest of the day. 1, I have an open door policy. 2, please flag any things that is an issue right now. Together, we are more effective at solving challenges as opposed to on your own. And then we can manage expectations. So the next part of the check-in is where we need to manage an upset lawyer or an upset client, focusing on that. And generally, I think often accountants like things in writing, but email is not the most effective way to deal with the situation. So it's either a quick face-to-face or a call. And then the middle of the day, we schedule our meetings. So most of them would start after 10, either client meetings where it is about a new process or whether it's about billing and regulation, or in some cases, the Institute Fees Committee, where we look at payment plans in difficult times. And then in the afternoon, we do a lot of our technical finance stuff. So making sure we report on what our capacity is for the day, what our current metrics are that we measure by lawyers. So we do that, and then we do a lot of training. Because one of the key things that is different to banking is that business acumen and understanding numbers is not something that comes naturally to everyone. And so actually spending time around making sure everyone understands what lever drives what, and the relevance of the business strategy, the client management, the financials linked to that, and our working capital cycle and our actual numbers on the ground and how those translate into performance becomes quite a big part of the afternoon, because a lot of our lawyers will have done their client meetings in the morning, and a lot of my team will have addressed the financial pieces. So in the afternoon, it really is about then closing out those gaps. I would like to say that generally my day starts with a to-do list, but that moves and fluxes as ad hoc requests come up. And then at the end of the day, we close out on any key critical outstanding items. I check in at least once a week with the office managing partners and our teams on the ground across each of the countries, which makes quite a big difference. And that interaction means that we know about things that are problematic ahead of them, finding themselves in the general ledger, where it's a bit like being the goalkeeper in a soccer match. It's hard to fix then. You can fix it, but it just takes so much longer. And also a lot of big decisions happen in the car park, at the coffee machine, etc.
Of course. Yeah.
So making time to have those conversations and understand the lay of the land and the culture, I think is particularly important, because you make decisions, as Robert Cooper said, with 3 things: your head, your heart, and your gut. And each of those 3 brains requires time on the floor and time with people and clients.
Do you believe in a structured or an unstructured day?
I believe in creating structure and ambiguity. And I say that because the new normal means things change every day, but also conscious that within my team, there are various pillars that we look at, and some individuals need complete structure, which is why we have the processes, procedures, etc., that help them function at their best in their spaces. But in my role, it's probably got a framework of structure, but I need to be agile, and optionality is important.
Right, so we're running out of time, and I want quick answers to these questions.
Perfect.
I see that you're married to an ex-Zimbabwean entrepreneur, and you have 4 children, and you ride motorbikes. What bike?
Harley Davidson, but having the 4th child, I now have to resign myself to being a pillion, which I'm not loving. But I do really, really love bikes. And my husband builds classic bikes with my boys, which I think keeps them safe and sound in the garage. And my daughter, at the first snap of the fingers, will join me on the back of the bike with a helmet and her boots. But I've got a family that quite like their bikes.
All right, where did your husband go to school?
Pretoria Boys actually is where he went to high school.
Didn't go to school in Zimbabwe?
No, came up when he was younger.
What are some of the big concerns you have as an accountant and chief financial officer looking towards the future? Is there any particular piece of legislation that gives you cause for concern?
So I think more and more there's a requirement for transparency. And so as a consequence, the Protection of Personal Information Act, so the POPI Act, is important, and understanding what
Can you just spell out what the POPI Act stands for?
The Protection of Personal Information.
Thank you.
And the reason that it's important is that we want financial statements to be more transparent. We want to be able to disclose our results more and more, whether you're a private company, CC, etc., where people can understand them, whether they're users, your debtors, etc. And we've seen that now in the recent spaces you've asked around the corruption, the issues around why didn't our financials tell us that? So I think understanding the protection of our own information, understanding the demands, either through society, etc., and wanting more information, means that we need to be quite deliberate about our messaging and understanding how it's received. And I think making it a little bit more simpler for the layman to understand. So understanding accounting and the speed at which accounting standards change, as well as marrying that to regulation, and then what we need to actually share with our various stakeholders, I think is really important. It must be relevant. And instead of being an accountant, generally have been rear view focused. So this is what happened in the past, and I report on it, is to move from being a reporter to a little bit like you, to being a journalist, to being able to predict where we're going, show people plan A versus plan B, and be really articulate and confident that this is what we think it's likely to look like. So I think that from a regulatory perspective will start to shape and frame the level of transparency. So more and more we've seen demonstrated that regulation will drive behavior to some degree, but actually being able to ensure that your counterparts, there's a lot more regulatory pieces that come out of peers saying this is what you did doesn't seem like it's right. So you're governed partly by your peer group. So that is important. And then accountants that can think, I think, is really deliberate. Like, have you created enough space in your day job to think about whether what you're doing is right and wrong, to understand what the industry looks like outside of the little slice you sit in? Because if we compare ourselves to ourselves, you'll never notice when we look like we're doing particularly well in a sector that's doing really poorly, and flag things that don't look right. So that piece for me is really important. I'm not sure that that's taught or if that is experience that is required, but there's something about being taught to think and question and ask why.
Okay, there's a book that recently come out called Life After Google by George Gilder, where he talks about the future of accountants and lawyers, and with blockchain technology, a lot of these routine functions. You already mentioned that at Bowmans you have a bot, an AI, artificial intelligence bot, which I guess is taking over some of the mundane work. This is going to become more and more a feature of day-to-day life. And so as a professional, and Nicholas has been discussing this, I think, with his team for quite some time, you're going to have to be more and more specialized. Yes. You're not going to be operating as a typical bookkeeper. You're going to be doing the things which add value to your client's business in whatever way, shape, or form that is. Okay, moving on. Who were your influences in life? Who inspired you to take the path that you took in your career as a professional? Okay,
so I think a couple of things. One, I am privileged enough to be born on the same day as Nelson Mandela.
Which is what date?
18th of July.
Okay.
And I matriculated in 1994. Okay. So I think a lot of what influenced me was who he was, his journey, his approach, and specifically his approach to humility and people and influence, and how he led. And I think that the fact that we are human first, which I've mentioned before, he's definitely shaped how I interact with people in terms of reading up what he did, the value of education, and that the person on the other side of the door, for example, even at Robben Island, they are influenced by what they know as opposed to what you know. So how do you put yourself in someone else's shoes? So with that, it was always never believe the first story. There are three sides, yours, mine, and the truth, and maybe another one in the process. My dad, he's an engineer. He's worked across the region. He was from Zambia. And so he was always accepting of everyone, which is important, but very deliberately, as we grab said, never lose your awe for life. So almost that intrigue when you watch people see an airplane take off for the first time and you wonder how something that big can fly, is don't lose that wonder and awe and be always curious. And I think when I've lost a sense of curiosity, that's when I've gone to find somewhere different.
I still find it staggering that a plane can take off.
It's amazing. It's
Yeah.
just, and I still think, oh, wow. And when you're in the plane, that staggering feeling, a little bit nervous. My mum, who was very much around the fact that everyone is valued, and before you question and judge someone, understand where they come from. And she was quite deliberate like that. And I think growing up, I was a bit frustrated by the fact that she was almost everyone's mom. But as I've grown up, I've appreciated that more and more, that everyone needs someone and no person's an island. And I think from an individual perspective, that opportunity to say that you can lean on someone or that you've got someone you can confide in. And in the professional world, that is a mentor. As you move up, it's a sponsor. That piece has been part of probably how I grew up. And my husband, who's an engineer, which is really interesting, which is how he started his career, an entrepreneur, because that has influenced my risk appetite, how I approach logic. And I remember writing my board exam, and the question we had was around a pipeline carrying slurry from here to there and costing it. And he said to me, you would put it on a railway cart because the pipeline, it's too heavy for the pipeline. And I thought, sure, okay. So simplicity came very much from how does that link in? And then my children, they've asked me often what I do and why. When my sons were 8, they said, so Dad helps build stuff. What do you do? And I remember taking them into the bank with me, and we opened a bank account, and they were so upset that I wasn't the teller. When will I move to the front line? And I think what was interesting is it gave me perspective on the relevance of my role. It didn't touch the ultimate client, but if we were more cost efficient, more cost effective, that ultimate client would feel the benefit of some of the stuff my team did. So they're still, although I must admit my youngest did tell his teacher I'm a bank account, which is possibly not so wrong when it comes to your children. So that's it.
Great. If there are any books you could recommend, what would they be?
So Simon Sinek wrote a book called Start With Why. And I think more and more curious individuals in business are key. It's a very worthwhile read, particularly around how to inspire people to take action that has purpose and that you're quite deliberate about where you are. That trust equation, and I am a numbers geek, is so important. Understanding that actually the denominator in that is about self being last, and really creating relationships is important in that space. And I think more and more from a professional perspective, whether it's assurance, advisory, finance, or from a law piece, being trusted is becoming crucial. And once you break it, I think it's very difficult to rebuild. So doing work that has purpose and has action and that aligns to what's the right thing to do is important.
Any other books?
No, that one I think is probably the right one for individuals to read if they've got time. From a personal perspective, what I did discover is I'm busy reading The Seven Sisters, and the reason I say that's important is I have a book club, and actually driving your imagination is so important. And I think our brains are a bit like Tetris.
You want to disengage from the whole corporate thing. I get that. Yeah.
And I would love people to genuinely read more. I've read Steinheist, but the reason I think reading is so important is your brain's a bit like Tetris. It files things in your working memory into your short-term and long-term memory if you give it time to breathe. And so I think reading is almost a gift we don't do enough of. I do read a lot of articles, which I quite enjoy, and I find they steer me to technical pieces, but my creativity actually and the opportunity to solve problems comes from when I read fiction.
Tell us very briefly in one sentence, what does Bowmans do for corporate social investment?
Okay, so we do quite a bit. First of all, just to give you some context on numbers, we've done over 10,000 hours in CSI space. That's from a lawyer services perspective, which is nearly over 28 million rand. And what we want to try and do is really about making an impact under the umbrella around facilitating access to legal services. So we do a lot of work with new entrepreneurs, which I think is quite important around building a sustainable economy with children in terms of their rights, and as well as women in that space, and generally anything that is subjected to discrimination. So we do a lot that speaks to what resonates with where society is right now in terms of making a difference.
Who is your big human rights lawyer?
So we had Jonathan Brand for a while, so he's just retired.
Oh, yeah?
But we've got a number across the space, if you look at the number of lawyers. So it's quite interesting. It's Standard Chartered. We had to do 3 days of CSI as part of our leave entitlement. Here, pro bono is part of the things we track. So actually being genuinely invested in making a difference in your relevant community and within the projects that we drive is part of the culture. It's how you grow up. It almost is you set aside time for this. And so we can see that in the passion of our lawyers that do this work. I can see that in the numbers around the type of work we do, and that often the conversation is it's the right thing to do. And what that right thing looks like. And we're busy with the silicosis case now. We're helping facilitate that.
Slow that down again. What is it?
That was the big mining case.
So the silicosis case?
Silicosis case. So and we're busy helping manage the rest of that process. So I do think we've done some really
Right.
big
I think for
pieces.
people who don't know, we probably should just point out the silicosis case was a case that was brought on behalf of thousands of South African and Southern African miners who were suffering from silicosis as a result of working underground. And it was settled. I think the final settlement was about 5 billion, something like that. And now comes the big payout, and they got to find the miners and pay them out.
And that process is currently in progress. And that kind of thing, when you walk around the building, and those are the things we celebrate. So, but nature, I think South African corporates don't celebrate enough our wins and successes. We think our work always speaks for ourselves. But so internally, this is one of the things that real feel-good factor where we are very conscious around what we do and the impact that has across the country.
Right. JoAnns Pohl, Chief Financial Officer from Bowmans, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me. What a superb way to engage across the pieces. I'm looking forward to more storytelling. To answer your question, Nicholas, I think storytelling is part of closing that gap on the education piece.
Agreed.
Thanks, Joe.